Howdy! Today I'm going to be talking about The Picture of Durian Gray by renowned playwright and one-time author Oscar Wilde. This copy came as a loan from my friend Olivia. Thank you for letting me have this for an extended period of time. I was initially planning on reading The Picture of Durian Gray for my former library's monthly reading prompt, that being a book with a color in the title. I've kind of been using those prompts as a means of getting through classics and older books. This one was a very obvious choice. It was either between this and Gravity's Rainbow, if you consider rainbow like a singular color, but I also feel like that will probably stay on my shelf intimidating me from afar for a long time. I got promoted within my district library, and so now I no longer go to that branch, but I still wanted to complete this out of a sense of obligation, not just to the book club, but to the book itself. This is incredible. It is entirely penetrable. It is almost addictively easy to read. It reads very much like a play. So much of this book is incredibly witty, snappy dialogue. This slew of aphorisms and thought-provoking exchanges between its three central and deeply interesting characters is the primary reason I would recommend this book. If you haven't read The Picture of Dorian Gray, it might impress as something very archetypal based on its premise alone. A story out of time, something that could exist pretty much at any period and still have resonant commentary and insight to offer. Just a side note, this doesn't really have any bearing on the review, but I swear to God, I always thought the title of this book was The Portrait of Dorian Gray. The story follows the titular Dorian Gray, a very beautiful young man who becomes the muse of a painter named Basil Hallworth, who fixates on his magnetic beauty intensely. Painting many portraits of him adds something to this final portrait of Dorian. He kind of puts something of himself into this painting, and it imbues it with this supernatural essence. As Dorian grows older, he does not physically age, but the more that Dorian's conscience withers away, the more the portrait atrophies into this hideous representation of Dorian. The third primary character, and the character that even in the preface to this book is described as having all of the best lines, is Lord Henry, a friend of Basil's who comes to know Dorian. Dorian becoming kind of fixated in his own right with Lord Henry, not for his visual allure, but for his corrupting intellectual effect. He's constantly indulging in these paradoxical phrases. I believe Dorian refers to him as the Prince of Paradox, someone who would sacrifice anyone in the world for the sake of an epigram. Whatever sound point our characters might bring up, Lord Henry will have a devilish refutation to it that will sound more appealing than the sound reasoning of the person he is mocking. Dorian tends to look up to Lord Henry as this person who is kind of above everyone. He has no moral tether to keep him grounded and dull. Wilde would describe each of these characters as a part of himself, Henry being what the world thought that he was, this kind of corrupting influence. Dorian, who he wishes he could be in another time, but Basil being probably who he more likely is deep down. The Picture of Dorian Gray is easily one of the best books I've read this year. It's just about 250 pages, and you could soar through it in a single day. It is just that readable, overflowing with insightful commentary and delicious writing. The central premise of the book is very rich already, and Wilde explores the themes that naturally arise from it in very layered but also very digestible ways. Dorian's descent into immorality lends the book a fantastic structure. You have this Garden of Eden style innocence demonstrated in the first act, his corruption under the influence of Basil, but primarily Lord Henry, who serves as something of a Luciferian character. Much like Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, Henry is the most enticing to read. We end up relating to Dorian in a couple of ways, despite his terrible callousness he takes on as the book progresses, in that Lord Henry seduces the reader with his perspective in the same way he seduces Dorian. When Lord Henry chooses to chime in after what Dorian has been through, unaware of Dorian's true nature, he comes across as being actually rather arrogant and as if he is talking about something he really doesn't understand firmly, that he doesn't really feel the effects of what he says, that he's just amused with his own perspective. At the core of the book is this divide between the aesthetic life and the moral life. That aesthetic beauty is often mistaken for goodness. Where I believe the book kind of transcends this very simple interpretation is in the details and the finer examination of this premise. Dorian falls in love with a girl who is performing love. This actress, Sybil Vane, who he sees playing Juliet on stage and is just enraptured with her beauty and chiefly like her artistic soul. They are engaged to be married. Dorian takes his friends to see her on stage. Suddenly, she's a wretched actress. Now that she has experienced real love, this facsimile through the artistic medium of performance is not substantial for her anymore, and so she sees it as a pointless exercise. Chooses instead to explore love in the medium of life itself. But it is this that disgusts Dorian, and Dorian just berates Sybil in such an incredibly cruel way because of how he has come to know her in this audience and artist kind of dynamic. This resonates as like a betrayal to Dorian. He can only process love through a layer of artifice. What is true to him is ugly and repellent. It's this effrontery to his entire nature, it seems. His friends saw his fiancée in such an embarrassing performance that it reflected back upon him. Reflections are a huge theme throughout this whole book. Sybil is so distraught that she commits suicide. Once Dorian hears of this, he has discovered the morphing nature of the picture, whereas before it depicted him as he once was. Now it has this kind of curdled smile to it. Lord Henry comes to visit and assures Dorian that he is not responsible for the suicide. Says some flippant remark about the nature of women. I find it very amusing that throughout the novel, Lord Henry is making these really derisive statements about women, and then by the end of the book, he's just very casually divorced. Prior to Lord Henry's intervention, Dorian was nearly at the realization of moral responsibility, even though he still doesn't feel this sense of guilt just yet, because he was able to see it reflected back in an aesthetic and artistic medium. He is now able to process that his actions were wrong. Once Lord Henry intervenes, Dorian ends up leaving with the counter perspective, that because the picture will take on the nature of his wrongful actions, he is actually not morally accountable. That somewhere within the atomic makeup of the painting, there has to be some slip in reality that has allowed it to become this mirror to his own soul, and kind of takes pride in it as a reflection of himself, that he has access to knowledge no one in the world has access to, and thus he can do whatever he wants, knowing that this picture will sponge up all of the bad things that he will do, that he can be wantonly lecherous and indulgent and cruel and cold-hearted to anybody, and the portrait will do the rest. He tries to conceal the painting in his boyhood study. This edifice to his own corruption is stored in a place that was very pure to him. Dorian is further corrupted after that by being lent a book by Lord Henry that is an account of every ill deed conceivable. And he becomes so obsessed with this like tome of sin, he kind of takes it as like a challenge. He reads it over and over again and tries to kind of live a life that will replicate the things contained within this book. The way that it like grips his soul, poisons his mind, it feels almost like cosmic. The polluting influence of infinite debauchery. So many years elapse. I think that the story resumes after chapter 11 when Dorian is 38 and we see that he has really changed for the worse. Just as beautiful as ever, to a point where people often mistake him for being this innocent person, but at his core, he is completely foul, and he has developed this reputation throughout town of being kind of a lech. While I do consider the Picture of Dorian Gray to be basically perfect, there is a sore spot for me. A rather belabored chapter bridging these two spans of time that the novel covers. Wilde just indulges in these lavish descriptions of objects that Dorian comes to possess over the years through his wealth. Wealth is also like an incredibly crucial element in this book too that I haven't even touched upon. I think that it upsets the rhythm of the book and also breaks from the the really incredible dialogue-heavy style Wilde had established prior, which he then just returns to. It just keeps going and going and going. An excessive amount of detail of all of the trinkets and doodads and objects of fancy that keep Dorian's mind occupied over the years. This chapter still does have value and contributes to Wilde's ultimate theme. And to me, it even has something of a modern kind of context that we all have infinite fascination at our disposal at all times. And are we not recoiling into it every now and then to escape from our own sense of consequence? While I do not at all believe that Wilde is using this novel to like condemn art, it's obviously like a work of art. He was an artist. I believe he is outlining a problem that is very real, propping up art as a higher virtue than being compassionate, being trustworthy, all of these things Dorian would scoff at. And while I do not believe we needed 20 pages of descriptions in order for us to get that point, there is another chapter later on where Dorian, after committing his most heinous deed yet, is trying to distract himself by reading books, murdering Basil Hallworth for confronting him about his moral decline, his ruined reputation. And I think also it is that Basil actually is able to see Dorian. Being perceived authentically is terrifying to him. Once we arrive at the murder of Basil Hallworth, the moral consequence of what Dorian is doing and the really interesting dialectic at the core of the book is still present, but it becomes more of a thriller in its latter stretches. Dorian trying to evade vengeance from Sybil's brother, who dies in a very ironic fashion, but because he's tormented at the thought of retribution, of being judged and perceived authentically, he chooses to destroy the painting. A perfect narrative end to the whole book. The painting has been restored to its full, youthful, vibrant subject, and Dorian is now a withered old man who has been murdered by his own hand in his attempt to destroy the painting. The people who find him can't even recognize him. That is the epitome of an airtight ending. Perfectly captures the narrative and thematic elements of the book in one final, truly arresting paragraph. In his latter years, Wilde incurred scandal for his relations with a young boy at the time, and it is pretty explicit that he was a gay man. The themes of homosexuality permeate this novel in ways that maybe aren't as explicit as a novel like Giovanni's Room, but I almost find them kind of more potent for their subdued quality. You have these weird little moments that pop up, like when Dorian first falls in love with Sybil Vane, she is wearing boys' clothes on stage. Basil Hallworth's fixation with Dorian is to such a point that, like, it is romantic. He is in love with Dorian, and there is a point where Dorian even acknowledges that nothing ruins friendship like romance. There are a lot of other male figures in the book vaguely described as having succumbed to Dorian's influence, and whether that's them being actually romantically entangled is left somewhat ambiguous, but I do think that you could easily interpret it as being a gay story, for sure. Thus, then, the themes of being petrified of being seen for what you truly are, I think that takes on another layer of meaning within this book. When Dorian first understands the nature of the picture, he is not really concerned that it is a sign that he is becoming a bad person. That is not what he is at first quite alarmed by. It is that his soul, which he recognizes the portrait is a reflection of, is hideous. And so Dorian cannot, I believe at least, even if Lord Henry had not intervened, be capable of acting as a moral person after this point. I think something that the Picture of Dorian Gray unknowingly weaves is this thought experiment about what would happen to a person if they discovered moral realism was true and what it would do to them. Having an understanding of your own moral status in kind of these objective metrics is not good. Being a good person is a conflict within each of us, I believe, an ambiguous one that we all must wrestle with. Something I found horrifying about the Picture of Dorian Gray, along with its many other terrifying notions, is what if we lived in a world where moral judgment was bound into the kind of like atomic fiber of reality, and we did have like some kind of fucking like virtue credit score, and how insufficient and also corrosive to the very concept of morality that would be. So always remember, kids, if you spot a moral realist out in the streets, it's on sight every time. Ordinary people waited till life disclosed to them its secrets, but to the few, to the elect, the mysteries of life were revealed before the veil was drawn away. Sometimes this was the effect of art, and chiefly of the art of literature, which dealt immediately with the passions and the intellect. But now and then a complex personality took the place and assumed the office of art, was indeed, in its way, a real work of art, life having its elaborate masterpieces, just as poetry has, or sculpture, or painting. In the context of that moment, Dorian is seeing Sybil herself as being like a work of art. Living a virtuous life, being a good person, is a beautiful thing, and is artful in a way. But for something to be artful, there must be someone perceiving the art. In the act of perceiving, artifice corrupts the true artfulness at the core of maybe even living a moral life. My first exposure to the story of Dorian Gray was through a TV series, I believe it aired on Showtime, which I only saw like the first season of, Penny Dreadful. There were also characters from other like works of Gothic literature like Frankenstein. I might pick it back up. I hear that like season 2 and 3 are pretty good. Although I wonder now if my familiarity with this subject matter will actually undermine my appreciation for how this is represented in the show, so I guess we'll see. I also really need to read Frankenstein. As far as the Picture of Dorian Gray is concerned, absolutely read it. It's a classic for a reason, total masterpiece, incredibly readable, very entertaining. It works fantastically as a tragedy and kind of like a crime thriller, a supernatural horror. It distills so many elements so perfectly because Wilde was an incredible writer. Loved this book. Would definitely recommend it. And that's all I got for this one. Thank you, and hope to see you soon.